Live.
With an election coming down the tracks, has the Chancellor delivered a vote-winning budget? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP Stephen Hammond, Labour's Deputy National Campaign Coordinator Ellie Reeves, broadcaster and former Labour advisor Aisha Hazarika, and Deputy Editor of Conservative Home Henry Hill. Today.
Growth up, jobs up, taxes down. I commend this statement to the House.
With an election in sight, has the Chancellor done enough to turn his party's fortunes around?
What I did yesterday was show how we're growing the economy, how our plan is working, and we're doing that partly because we're bringing down taxes.
By the end of the Parliament, living standards will be lower than they were when people last went to the polls.
Will the cut to national insurance mean less cash for services?
If we're going to keep these tax cuts, we're going to get cuts in spending. If we're not going to have those cuts in spending, I'm afraid taxes will rise later on.
And will new rules on holiday lets help locals get on the housing ladder? This charity worker will tell us about the situation in Cornwall. Yes, so we've got all the analysis today of Jeremy Hunt's budget yesterday. Over an hour he was at the dispatch box. Let's have a look at some of the front pages responding to what was announced. In the Daily Telegraph, Hunt signals the end of national insurance. This was how The Guardian reported it, a last desperate act, with Jeremy Hunt there and his Treasury team. The Daily Mail, will it be enough to see off Labour? And finally, The Mirror. We deserve better. Well, before we get into some of the substance and detail, an initial thought from the panel. Stephen, will people feel better off after this budget?
They'll start to feel better off. This is, I think, what you saw yesterday was a continuation of something that Jeremy Hunt started to lay out last autumn, which is ensuring that we see growth in the economy, and the number of measures which we're probably going to discuss later about that. I think the key message yesterday was obviously a continuation of cut of national insurance rewarding work, which is what we set out, and some people that I myself have been arguing strongly inside the party we should do that. And I think that if you look at the nitty-gritty of the detail, slowly but surely the economy is beginning to improve. Inflation has fallen. You saw the OBR increased growth forecast yesterday.
Although we have been
and also the growth, just to your final point, the growth per capita, the OBR put up again yesterday, and it's seeing through the next 2 years.
Will people feel better off after yesterday's budget?
I don't think people will feel better off after the budget. The tax burden is still the highest it's been in 70 years. For every extra 10 pence that's been taken, the government are only giving 5 pence back, and people are still facing higher mortgage repayments because of that mini budget that crashed the economy under Liz Truss. Food inflation is still high. People are paying more in the weekly shop. So I don't think people will feel better off after the budget.
What do you think, Aisha?
I don't think people are feeling better off at all, and it's interesting just looking at all the big sort of economic analysts who've done their number crunching overnight. The general consensus is that sort of living standards generally have been squeezed over this Parliament. But I think it's not even just how people are feeling in terms of the money in their pockets and their mortgages, it's how they feel their public services are serving them as well. I think it's a sort of, people have a holistic feel to this. And even though people might be getting a few pounds back in terms of some of the cuts, they can't see their doctor. They're worried about what the state of the schools are. So I think the public is looking at this in the round. They're looking at their own personal budgets, and they're also looking at the things that really affect them, which is public services.
Do you think people will feel better off?
Not enough. Obviously, compared to if the tax cuts hadn't happened, some of them will be a bit better off. There are a few things in there that will be really tangible. The changes to the thresholds for child benefit clawback, for example. The families that benefit from that really will feel that benefit, and I think that's the kind of thing the Chancellor was looking for. But in general, his freezing tax thresholds means that, in fact, lots of people are going to be sucked into higher tax thresholds on the same real income as now. They're still grappling with the cost of living crisis. I don't think whatever benefits there are from this budget are concentrated enough and tangible enough to make a difference to the voters in the ballot box.
Let's talk to the BBC's chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman, because, of course, as is tradition, the Chancellor and Shadow Chancellor have been on the airwaves, of course, talking about the contents of that budget. Henry, it's an election year. That was no doubt the last budget before an election later on in the year, whenever it happens. Have we seen the contours, the outlines, the battle lines that have been drawn?
Definitely to some extent, Jo. I mean, I think you could see from Jeremy Hunt's statement, if not quite from the policies yesterday, a bit of how the Conservatives will fight that election, whether the starting gun's fired in a few weeks or in a few months. He was basically trying to say to the public that a corner is being turned, and trying to land the argument that a corner is being turned specifically because of the actions that he, Jeremy Hunt, but also Rishi Sunak have taken. I think the political risk there is that members of the public dealing with their own individual circumstances don't feel like a corner has yet been turned. And so the risk there is that rather than rewarding the Conservatives, some people might feel like the Conservatives are just out of touch with their own circumstances. The other thing, the other election battleground potentially that we've seen kind of come out of nowhere yesterday was when Jeremy Hunt started talking, or rather I should say gesturing, at the possibility of one day abolishing national insurance altogether. And Labour have gleefully seized upon that this morning. They're comparing him to Liz Truss, saying that abolishing national insurance over some unspecified time period, we still don't really know what that might mean. They're saying that that would be a bigger unfunded tax cut than those that Liz Truss had in her mini-budget back in 2022. I think we're going to hear a lot more of that argument over the coming days and weeks.
Where does it leave Labour?
Well, there's a big political problem for the Labour Party that was absolutely deliberately generated by Jeremy Hunt in the budget, because he stole one of Labour's big policies and abolished non-dom tax status himself. Now, crucially, quite a lot of Labour's spending commitments, not that they have that many big spending commitments beyond the government's, were to be funded by abolishing non-dom tax status. Labour say today they're still sticking to those spending commitments. Well, they're going to have to find a new way to fund them.
Henry Zeffman, thank you very much. Labour are still around 20 points ahead in the polls, Stephen. Will this budget change that, move the dial?
I think very few budgets by themselves ever move it. And I think that's clear. We've seen that. You know, if you think about the last few years, the only budget, you know, the budgets that have moved them are very rare. What I think, as I said in my opening remarks, I think this is and Henry made that point, the economy, I think, is starting to turn. And I can see over the summer that starting to continue to improve. And I think that will be key.
What about the reaction from Conservative MPs and backbenchers? There wasn't a sort of feeling of great cheer, perhaps because Jeremy Hunt didn't do what some wanted, which was income tax cuts, which might have moved the dial in their minds.
It might. The reason that the government tends to favour national insurance these days is because, one, it concentrates the benefit on working age people, and two, it's not devolved, which means that if you're the Scottish Conservatives especially, you can campaign on an NI cut in the way that you can't campaign on an income tax cut. But yeah, Conservative MPs are frustrated because they know that this is not the kind of budget that is going to close a 20-point poll deficit. I don't think there is one, but if you were really looking to do something that could save a lot of seats at the expense of being perhaps slightly mad, you know, you could do some really nuke from space stuff, index-linked tax thresholds, and then you know do that, like something like that. But this, because it's sticking vaguely within the OBR and the boundaries of plausibility, and because the political battlefield is so narrow between Jeremy Hunt and Rachel Reeves, like, no, it's not going to save the election.
Well, on that point, what's Labour's pitch? There's not much to pick between the two of them.
Well, I think what is really telling about this election as well, looking at the raw politics, there's been a lot of fevered speculation over the last week, 10 days, 2 weeks, from the Labour Party as well, saying there's going to be a May election. I do not feel that this budget
it did not
feel like it was a pitch rolling, guess what, we're going to march our troops up to the top of the hill. I think the readout, particularly stealing the non-DOMs idea, given that Jeremy Hunt has spent a good number of years slagging it off as being sort of fiscally illiterate and it's not going to work and it's going to drive people out of the country, suddenly saying, right, we're going to do this. Two things we can read into it. A, the cupboard is quite empty in terms of fresh ideas. But B, for the rest of us as political watchers, it's not going to be terribly exciting until the election, because if you're Labour, why would you put more stuff out there if the Tories are just going to nick it? So I think we're going to be in a holding pattern now, quite a frustrating holding pattern until the general election, because if Labour does put anything out, the Tories will just nick it, so what's the point?
Well, I mean, but the Labour Party nicked Tory plans at the beginning of the year when Rachel Reid did an absolute 180-degree turn on bankers' taxes. So one party taking another party's ideas, and whether or not it's a good idea, a good thing to do that, and I think in particular on the non-DOMs, a lot of us will be looking very carefully at how this new plan is going to work rather than what the Labour Party was planned, because we recognise capital is mobile, and that is a concern. But, you know, I think that the idea that the Labour Party aren't going to have to answer the question, how are you going to pay for this, and not say anything till the general election, which may well be 6 months from here, seems to be an unsustainable position.
Well, I'm going to ask you about the non-dom policy in just a moment, but we've just been told that Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has been asked if he will rule out a May election, and he says, I'm not saying anything about that.
God. I mean, in fairness, why would you? If you're the Prime Minister and you have the freedom of manoeuvre and you can keep your opponents guessing, you don't really benefit much from pinning down the date. I guess the only danger is if he allows the speculation to play too long, then Labour might be able to dress it up as bottling it, which is what damaged Gordon Brown so much.
Yes, it
also,
did.
I would just say, given that Grazia interview, he and his family look in no rush to leave Downing Street.
Oh, really? Is that what you read from that interview of the two of them? How hilarious. I love the interpretation. Well, no Prime Minister likes to go early, do they, generally, whether it's Downing Street furniture or not, or the accommodation. Just on the non-DOMs, now the Conservatives have stolen one of your key policies. There really is nothing to pick between you and Labour. What is your pitch going to be that's going to be different to the Conservatives?
Well, they have stolen our policy. And what I would say, first of all, is that if they'd adopted it a couple of years ago and put it into bringing down NHS waiting lists down and breakfast clubs in primary schools, we'd have had close to 4 million operations on the NHS, over 4 million children benefiting from primary schools. We need to look at the detail of the budget. I mean, the figures came out yesterday, and I know that Rachel is looking through that line by line. We have committed to those 2 million extra procedures.
You are committed to it. So where are you going to find the money now?
Clubs. Well, Rachel will be going through line by line to see what we can do. This is a pledge that we've made. It's important for the country to bring down those waiting lists and to give every child the best possible start to the day, freeing up parents to go to work. So we've committed to that.
Come what may, you will go ahead with the commitments you made.
We've committed to those, but everything has to be fully funded, which means now going through what was published yesterday to work out how that can be paid for. Everything in our manifesto will be fully funded. That's the responsible thing to do, and it's responsible for us now to go through the detail to work out how it will be paid for.
Well, let's talk to Luke Trill. He's the director of the research group More in Common, and he's been speaking to people in focus groups about the budget and generally the state of the parties. What did your focus group say, Luke?
Well, last night we ran a focus group of residents of Whitby. It was an all-female group, and all of them had voted Conservative in 2019 and were now undecided about how they're going to vote in the election. So this is a really crucial group for the Conservatives to win back. And unfortunately, at first glance of the budget for this group, they weren't that impressed. To give you some of their kind of initial reactions, it was, this is a drop of nothing. It doesn't touch the sides, and it's robbing Peter to pay Paul. So there was just this sense from that group that actually the scale of what was being offered by the Chancellor wasn't matching what they had already lost in terms of rising bills, rising food prices, and interest rates as well.
OK.
And it was particularly interesting that when we asked them about the previous national insurance cut, not one member of the group could actually remember having got that cut in their pay packet. It had totally sort of passed them by. And so I think a worry for the government will be how they message this cut and make sure that people notice it.
Right. What about Labour? Did you ask them about the opposition?
We did, and if there is one bright spot for the government, it's that this group, at least, weren't that convinced that Labour would be able to do a better job. They said they hadn't really heard anything from the opposition, which convinced them that they would be able to solve the cost of living crisis. You know, what one of the participants said, well, if we've got no money under this government, how are we going to have more money under a new government? So they weren't that enamoured. And interestingly, normally in these focus groups, when you test, is it time for change or should we stick with the plan? More people lean towards time for change. This group were actually quite nervous about the notion of change. And what they said is, we've had so much turmoil recently. And one woman said, we've had so many prime ministers recently. I'm worried what another round of upheaval might mean. And what it said to me is, we're going to see both parties who desperately want to win this group of voters really playing it safe. This isn't going to be an election where people are going to be promising radicalism. It's going to be safety first all the way from both the government and the opposition.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Luke Trill. And we'll pick up on a couple of those points, particularly the one about not really noticing this focus group, the first 2p cut in national insurance, which was announced in the autumn statement. But we heard the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt talking, of course, about another 2p cut to national insurance, and the Conservative Party have been tweeting along similar lines. Let's just show our viewers. This is what happens when you stick with the plan that's working. We're cutting your taxes again. That means the average worker on £35,000 a year will save £900 this year. Now, did that tweet, Stephen, miss out the small print, which is that you're also raising taxes by more than you're cutting them?
Some people will be drawn into higher rate because of fiscal drag, which is what you're referring to.
A lot of them, yeah.
Well, some will be. I think the point that actually Luke was making, and that is reiterating, is that there is for working age people, they are now going to be £900 a year better off, 4% cut.
But are you worried that they haven't noticed? Are you worried that some of them haven't really felt it?
Well, perhaps that's a failure of communication. We need to make sure they do notice it, and traditionally people do notice it quite often in the April pay packet, because that's when the changes normally come through to income tax codes and other things. And I think they will notice it, particularly if we keep talking about it.
Right, but if I show you this graph, the latest figures for the overall level of tax, we got them yesterday. This is tax as a percentage of the overall economy or GDP. You can see very clearly here, 36.1% in 2023-24, up from 2010 when the Conservatives came in, from 32.4%, rising to that record high, the highest overall tax burden since 1948, to 37.1%. So, overall, your government has raised taxes time and again. That is correct.
The overall tax burden will be higher. But also, if you looked at that chart, of course, it was interesting to see where that tax burden started increasing, which was at the time of the COVID shock, where any government of any political persuasion, I think, would have made the correct choice to borrow that money, to put into furlough schemes and other support schemes, to borrow that money to counter the energy price shock, to support families. And that's why the level of debt is so high. And that's why we are going to have to start paying some of that back.
Why does Labour, with one or two differences, I know there are one or two different policies, although, as I say, one of them, the non-doms, has gone, why do you support the government's tax and spending plans?
Well, people are facing the highest tax burden for 70 years, which is why we won't be opposing the national insurance reduction. We want taxes on working people to be lower, but the problem is that we've had such low growth in this country over the last 14 years of Conservative government. As a result of that, people don't feel better off. Our public services are failing. They're creaking at the seams because of this low growth. And there was no plan in the budget yesterday to grow the economy. Where's the industrial strategy? You know, Labour would introduce a national wealth fund to invest in the industries
one of your
in the future.
Your green growth plan has been diluted, it's changed, it's not going to be this ambitious promise. Where are you going to get growth?
Well, it is ambitious, but when that was first announced, it was 3 years ago, and we're in a very different place now because interest rates on debt are so high after the Conservatives crashed the economy with Liz Truss's mini budget. So we have to be realistic about that. But we'd still have a national wealth fund investing in the industries of the future, gigafactories, carbon capture and storage, you know, the green tech of the the future. But there's no strategy from the Conservatives. You know, we'd reform planning laws to get things building again. This isn't happening under the government.
But you can't guarantee those things will happen. I know you do want to bulldoze through planning applications and planning laws, but again, we don't know if that is achievable. It's the same with your plan in terms of green growth. We're in recession, certainly have been in recession, and growth has bumped along the bottom, but there's no guarantee you'll be able to improve it.
We've got a plan, and that's what's lacking from the government.
Right. I mean, listening to that people are nervous in that focus group about change. It's quite interesting. You'd have thought that perhaps this was the moment for change.
Well, I think when you look back at everything that's happened from Brexit to the COVID panic, the crisis, there has been a lot of change. So you can understand that people don't want change in a way that feels perilous and destructive. But I do think that people clearly are aching for change in this country. You look at the by-elections, you look at everybody's lived experience. But I also think when people look back, and people are not going to go through the red book and all of this thing, but certain things will feel true to people after this length of Tory rule. Do they feel better off? They don't. When they look around the country, do they think the country is in a better place? No, they absolutely don't feel like that. And I'm afraid we're seeing quite a few things coming together. This low growth is a very, very big problem and will be a problem for a future Labour government. You don't just rock up in Downing Street and pull a big lever that says growth. This stuff takes time. But also, I think we are seeing genuinely the effects as well of all of these years of austerity, which I remember when I was working for Ed Miliband and Ed Balls, there was this line that was used saying these levels of spending cuts are going to do real damage to the country and choke off growth. And that has actually come to pass. People's living standards have gone down. People have not been invested. You need public services to grow your economy as well. So I think we're seeing lots of things coming together now.
I mean, the cuts. You can take issue with the way that the government did, the coalition government did austerity, but the idea that you could simply have spent your way through the recession and then spent your way now, you can just continued endlessly spending. I think that the wariness. But not all of it. Not all of it was capital expenditure. The capital expenditure cuts will have damaged growth. Revenue expenditure cuts have not, and there were lots of those. I think that the nervousness is down to our political moment, really, because Labour can't offer radicalism apart from maybe on planning. But I think the problem will be if they win too big, they'll have an awful lot of MPs in the kind of areas that don't want new homes, don't want factories, don't want railways, etc. Will they be able to face them down? But if they don't do that, there are no big new revenue streams out there, right? So they can't promise to increase spending very much. And therefore, what sort of change do you actually want?
Well, what is the state going to do less of, Stephen? Because there are cuts coming down the line. I mean, it may be a sort of scorched earth policy for Labour to inherit if they win the election. But we know the figures. We've seen them. The OBR have put them out. Unprotected public departments are going to see cuts of 3.5%. So what's government going to stop doing?
I think the interesting thing is what Jeremy's strapline yesterday was it's not a bigger but a better state. And that's interesting in terms of...
A smaller state, then?
A smaller state in a number of areas. And also, you saw, yes, I think one of the most significant parts of yesterday's budget was the productivity investment into the NHS, which will start to deliver over a period of time. Those reduction in the backlog. It will start to put in the new machines, which will allow more operations.
Productivity.
But the way that you drive productivity is with capital expenditure.
Well,
the government has allowed, since George Osborne, the NHS to raid capital budgets to top up day-to-day spending. The scrapping of HS2 was a big capital project, and they're now announcing that they're spending it on subsidising bus fares and repairing roads. Like, you can only get productivity by ring-fencing capital expenditure, and this government has consistently failed to do that.
But yesterday's productivity announcement was principally about capital, and it was in terms of that productivity.
Can I just make one other point? People have just go on and on and on about this productivity puzzle, and nobody has any real solutions to it. Don't forget as well that a lot of that money for day-to-day spending is going to try and go to actually deal with some of the pay disputes as well. And people are worried that some of that capital that's going into the digitalisation will take money from other areas of spending. And also this idea that everything can just be cut. You look across public services right now, particularly in local, there's nothing left to cut. They've been cut to the bone. And when you talk about public waste, you look at the science department having to spend £15,000 because a minister libelled somebody on on Twitter. I just think this idea of and by the way, the Labour Party does this as well, saying that everything can be solved just through better productivity. The public isn't buying that anymore.
Well, she's right,
but
isn't she? Well, sorry, you respond.
Well, I was going to say, I agree with Aisha, actually, that productivity is the puzzle this economy has struggled with for 30 years. You know, one saw when the periods of peak spending under Labour, Gordon Brown had to redefine productivity.
So why is it suddenly going to appear? So why is it suddenly going to appear now?
Part of it, as Henry said, is we need to make sure that capital budgets are protected. Part of it is we need to increase the quality and the training we give to people, and that's happening as well.
Right, and you are guilty of it too. Promises of efficiency savings. Rachel Reeves going line by line, looking under all the sofas for the cash. Where is it going to come from?
I think there's a big issue that the government have had 14 years to sort some of this stuff out. So, for example, on the NHS, and Jeremy Hunt spoke yesterday about a paperless NHS. Well, he promised that when he was Health Secretary and said it would be done by 2018.
But Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, talks about reform. He's going to reform the NHS, and that's going to lead to higher productivity and efficiency savings.
But the government have had 14 years and they've failed. They've failed on this, and I don't think people trust them to get this right. You know, we've had this low growth. You know, we've had, when it comes to productivity, we've got an issue of skill shortages. You know, there are simple things that this government could have talked about in the budget, like, for example, reforming the apprenticeship levy and introducing a skills
Ellie,
and growth
will you
levy.
be honest? Will Labour be honest
things.
with voters when it comes to the election campaign that there are going to be cuts to public services? There are going to have to be cuts to unprotected departments, and you spell out what they'll be.
We don't know what mess we will inherit if we're lucky enough and privileged enough to form a government.
You've seen the figures.
But we've had low growth under this Conservative government over the last 14 years, and it's a mess. They crashed the economy, and we're under no illusions about the difficult challenges ahead.
Right. How long will the honeymoon period be, do you think, just briefly, for Labour if they win?
Well, I think if Labour win, they're very aware that there is certainly not going to be a very long honeymoon period, if one at all. What they will inherit if they win is going to be incredibly difficult. And, we all know, and I think we have to be honest, reform is really, really important in lots of bits of our economy and society. But also, to do good reform often takes investment at the beginning to make those reforms possible over time.
Let's pick up something else Jeremy Hunt talked about, because he mentioned immigration and migration a number of times in his budget. Let's have a listen.
If we want that growth to lead to higher wages and higher living standards for every family in every corner of the country, it cannot come from unlimited migration.
But Stephen, under the Conservative Party and Conservative governments, net migration numbers have passed historic highs, over 700,000. And the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which marks the government's homework on these issues, says you can only reach your growth figure that they have forecast if you raise the net migration. So how's Jeremy Hunt not going to rely on unlimited migration?
I've been on your programme before, and I said I think we need to be honest with people about this. I think it's really clear that we need to separate asylum and refugee status.
Sure.
Illegal migration.
I'm talking about legal.
And I'm just going to come on to that, Jo. And legal migration. And I don't think by conflating all of those three, we are getting a proper discussion. We need to have a proper look at what are the skills this economy needs, what are we generating ourselves, what are people do we need to see migration for? And I accept that we have not got down to the level that David Cameron talked about, but we also need to accept as a party and as a country that migration is going to be important for the economy.
Well, that may be honest. Is it popular within your party?
Well, I'm not entirely sure it is honest. I think it's telling that HM... some immigration is absolutely essential. No one's denying that. But I think it's telling that both HM Treasury and the DWP have deliberately decided to collect less accurate data about the economic contribution of different sorts of migrant. And the OBR itself has said that in the long term, migrants who come here and just work here for a while and go home, they're a net contributor. But actually, if you forecast over the long term, people who move here and settle down permanently, the fiscal balance for them is much less clear. Now, the problem that, it's slightly strange hearing Jeremy Hunt, of all people, being like, who is responsible for all of this immigration when he leads the Treasury? The problem that you have as the Conservatives, and that Labour will have the same problem, if you actually want to drive up wages and you want to boost productivity, which comes from raising wages, you need to restrict employers' access to to unlimited cheap labour. And no government wants to do that because in the short term, it's very difficult. At the moment, we subsidise employers' basic education through universities. And then if they can't find the skills they want after that, they get a shortcut through the visa system. Now, it would be a very wise, brave Chancellor from either Labour or the Conservatives who faced that down, said actually we're going to force employers to internalise the cost of training, we're going to time limit shortage occupation declarations, and so on. But neither party have so far shown any willingness to do that.
Right. Are you going to rely on immigration in terms of growth?
Well, there needs to be a much clearer link between migration and skills, and I think that's really lacking. You know, we talked earlier about the Conservatives stealing our policies, but one of the things that we called for was an end to the 20% discount for the shortage skills list. One of the issues.
Who are you going to stop coming here then? If you look at those skills lists, I had it, the shortage occupation list. It was thick. I mean, they were 40 maybe. Are you going to cut those?
But there's been occupations on that list that have been on that list for the last 14 years.
Sure.
And the problem is that what happens? They go on the list, then it sits in a box somewhere and nothing happens.
So what are you going to take off?
Well, what we would do is make sure that we have got the skills here. So we'd set up technical excellent colleges, working in partnership with local communities, with local businesses to make sure that we are training people up with the skills that they need for the jobs in this country, rather than just relying on migrant labour. And I think that's really important.
Would you make employers pay for
We're not filling those. We're not filling those
relying just on migrant labour. It's a mixture, but I think we need to be honest about the level of migrant labour we need.
Yeah,
that's all I'm saying.
What do we need? I mean, broadly speaking, what sort of levels? 400,000, 500,000? I'm talking broadly. What do you think the levels of net migration should be?
Well, I think that we would have, if you were sitting here now, you'd start to want to look at 5 years. Hence, what are the occupations where you're not training the skills in the UK? What are the services that are still going to amount? So you can probably guess that social care is still going to need more people. And a lot of them, as Henry's point, has come and then do leave after a period of time.
Right, but these are jobs that people here don't seem to want to do.
Well, that is exactly the point I was going to be. Look, it's a bit like the productivity puzzle that we were talking about. We have this, ongoing conversation where we have all parties, the big two parties, saying we've got to get local people to do these jobs. Now, that's all fine and well, but again, that takes time. You can't force people to do jobs they don't want to do. We don't have a situation where we're literally forcing people to do that. To Ellie's point, you do need to sort of train people up. However, that takes time, that takes a big strategy, and again, it takes money. You know, that's a big amount of work for further education colleges to do. And again, you can't just pull a lever and suddenly everybody is sort of skilled up and ready to do these jobs. And I think, to Henry's point, I think the reason why politicians are reluctant to say and do what you've suggested is because that will be a period of economic pain. That will be a period of pain for the country, and nobody wants to say, look, everybody, here's the reality. And also, post-Brexit, we were told actually that's what we're going to do. We're going to restrict supply, and and nobody wants to make the country poorer willfully.
In the short term, but all of those transitions are going to be necessary for every
Jeremy Hunter seems to be saying, yes, we do need to be poorer.
That's because he's about to lose a German election. like, if he genuinely thought he was going to win next year, he probably wouldn't be saying that stuff, right? But the problem is that all of these transitions are going to be painful because currently we have an unsustainable system. We have, we've swept social care under the local government rug, and now the rug is catching fire and councils are falling over. Projections for NHS, pension spending, social care spending are only going up. We have an ageing population. We have a shrinking working age tax base. Like, shifting from that model is going to hurt.
Right.
And until we get to a political place where one party or the other is prepared to do that, we're going to be stuck with this kind of delusive politics where Rachel Reeves and Jeremy Hunt fight over a tiny amount of territory.
Are you going to cut net migration?
Migration's high, and we're reliant on migrant labour. I don't think putting figures on it is particularly helpful, because you have to be able to respond to things like what happened in Ukraine, Hong Kong, those sorts of things. So putting a figure on it, I don't think was particularly helpful. But being reliant, we talked about social care. Well, one of the things Labour would do is introduce fair pay agreements in social care, making sure that it is paid decently, so that we're not constantly relying on migrant labour for the jobs. Making sure that we've got the skills that we need.
That would push up the cost of social care, though. So how would you pay for that if you're making social care much more expensive?
Well, look, that's something that we need to look at in terms of that fair pay agreement. But it's important that we're not just reliant on cheap labour from abroad to do these jobs.
But I think what we're seeing here is just that that tension between the theoretical and the sort of principle, and Henry been saying, look, this is the goal and we'll have to get through pain of it. And then you have somebody who's potentially about to go into government saying, well, hang on a minute, we can't actually just, make things worse. And we have to be realistic, OK, with all of these conversations, whether it's about growth, whether it's about reform, whether it's about immigration, you can't just, none of us can just pull a lever and all of this stuff is magically going to happen. There is going to be a transition time. And in that transition time, one of the things that is not helping as well, we have created, and I think Stephen was right in his initial point, we've conflated all migration together and we talk about immigration now incredibly pejoratively, like everybody coming over here is somehow on the take or robbing us or doing something sort of bad. That's not helping the conversation either. We are going to have migration for a long, long time. This country has done many great things for migration. I'm a product of immigrant parents coming here, but we have to manage it properly. But we have to start having honest conversations with people about the trade-offs.
Well, we have an election campaign at some point. Maybe they'll happen then. Let's have a look at this headline in The Telegraph and cover some of the other announcements that Jeremy Hunt made. It says tax break to encourage second homeowners to sell. This was the announcement in the budget that the Chancellor is reducing the higher rate of capital gains tax on property from 28% to 24%. He also said the government's ending furnished lettings relief for landlords of holiday lets to bring them in line with the private rented sector in the hope that people will rent out their homes for a longer amount of time. And the stamp duty tax break when purchasing multiple properties in England or Northern Ireland is also set to end in June. Now, is this going to change the situation in parts of the country like Cornwall, where there are an awful lot of people letting out their homes to tourists? Monique Collins is from Disc Newquay, a charity which provides support for struggling families and residents in Newquay. Welcome to you. From your position as a charity, how is the situation in Newquay today compared to previously?
The situation is worse than it ever has been. I think this announcement is too little, too late, if you ask for my personal opinion. We have thousands and thousands of locals sitting in temporary accommodation and in hotel rooms. There is no new affordable housing being built. We see lots and lots of houses going up all around the Newquay area, but they're not affordable to local workers. And this is something that whoever is going to be in power will need to address. And Cornwall needs to be levelled up. We have Cornish wages with London prices, and it's unsustainable.
How big a problem are the holiday lets and that part of the tourist industry in Newquay for local housing?
Ever since we were put on the map by the G7, lots and lots of homeowners actually made people homeless, and have turned their properties into Airbnbs and into permanent holiday lets. We also see a lot of second homes being bought that subsequently stands empty the year round, and only in the summer when the sun comes out are they being used. We've also see apartments being bought by as second homes that then are being used as holiday lets. And I'm not saying that we don't need tourism. We most definitely need tourism because we are a tourist town.
Yes. I mean, it must have brought some streams of income into towns like Newquay.
Yes, but what has happened now with the restrictions lifted after COVID and everything else, it's far cheaper to go abroad than it is to come on holiday to Newquay, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So it's
OK.
It's not cheap to holiday in our own country. And if you look at buying an ice cream for £8 on a beach, if you've got 4 children, it's not a cheap way to holiday.
No, well, Monique, we've got politicians here and commentators. Stay for the discussion and let's hear what they say. I mean, Stephen, those announcements are not going to radically change the dire situation of shortage of housing, are they, in areas like Cornwall?
What they're starting to do is to change the discussion about what Monique is highlighting is that across the country, not just in Cornwall, but particularly in areas like that, we need more houses, and we've got to work out how we do that in a way. And what this is doing, though, is actually, I think, I take her point, it's a small start, but it's the start, and it's a start in the right direction. And it is things that are actionable quickly as well.
Right, but there are new houses being built, Monique says, but they're still not affordable.
Well, one of the things I would have liked to have seen Jeremy do yesterday is to allow local authorities who met housing targets to keep more of the stamp duty revenue, which then could have been re-put into affordable housing. The question, of course, is what is affordable, and that was a longer discussion. But there were some things we could have done yesterday which would have helped the supply, particularly in that focus. And some of it is affordable for rent as well as purchase.
Right. I mean, Labour is promising to bulldoze through planning applications, etc., in order to build the sort of homes perhaps Monique wants. But will you be prepared to come good on that if there is fierce opposition in Newquay to the sort of housing you're proposing?
Well, I think that we desperately need more homes, and I think Monique summed up why. You know, they've got local residents living in temporary accommodation, and that's happening actually in places like Cornwall, but also up and down the country, with people languishing in temporary accommodation for years because there aren't the homes for them. That's why we have said that we will build 1.5 million more homes, and you do need to reform planning in order for that to happen. So, you know, for local communities, working with them not on the if more homes should be built, but where and how they should be built, but making sure we get them, making sure that we fast track developments onto urban brownfield sites, which this government has promised time and again, but it hasn't happened. Making sure we recruit more planners so we can speed up applications so that developments don't get stuck in the planning system for years and years and years.
Sure,
not going anywhere.
And of course it will be about a political determination to drive that through. Monique, listening to our politicians here, what's the one thing you'd like them to do?
What I would like them to do is actually look at the way they are governing at the moment, because at the present moment, under the present rule, they can only act under the Section 106, and it's only when builders build over 11 houses that they then have a certain percentage that they should make social housing or affordable housing. And I think that percentage needs to be increased by a vast bigger amount than what it is now. Like I'm saying, we've seen more and more these new builds going up, and they're saying, oh, well, you can buy this under shared ownership. But when you look into this shared ownership and you go and buy this property, you have to first have a massive deposit to put down. You then only own 40% of your house, so you have to pay your mortgage on that. Then you've got to pay rent on the other 60%, and then there's a maintenance fee. But by the time you've got all that included,
it's unaffordable.
£2,500 a month, and then you've got your council tax and all your bills on top of it. It's just not feasible.
It's not affordable. I mean, the answer to this, of course, is a radical transformation. Labour say they'll do it, but with where we are and what Jeremy Hunt announced yesterday, is it going to stop holiday hotspots being sort of out of the range of local people?
No, and the tension here is that those areas are dependent on on the capital that comes from tourism.
Of course.
Right? So really, Newquay should be growing, right? If there's a huge influx of tourists in a normal environment, what you'd expect is that town would just be getting much bigger. We have an acute shortage and massive blocks on planning and building, so that isn't happening. And so you've got a zero-sum game between tourists and local people, which has to end. But that can only come from building, because, for example, if you did increase the share of social housing in a development, what that does is that knocks down the margin on a development, and it's a block on building. You just need vast numbers of more houses.
Monique, very briefly, because we haven't got much time, did you want to respond?
Yes, my point I'm trying to make is that we are going to see a massive influx of tourists, because they will all flock back, because that's what happens, because we have beautiful beaches and sunshine and everything else here. The only problem we are going to have is that we will not have the workforce to actually serve our tourists and to cook their meals and to clear their tables, because we've got nowhere for these people to live.
And that is a very good point, and was particularly stark after the pandemic.
Absolutely, and I do feel like there's something really kind of unpleasant about the idea of sort of local people being completely sort of pushed out an area and only allowed to be sort of bussed in to clean.
What do you do?
Well, I'm afraid, and I really hope the next Labour government will do this, got to build and build more, not just social, build more council houses. I think we've got to really make this an absolute priority. And of course, housing is something Henry and I've talked about many times on my programme. Housing is an issue which, you know, affects wherever you are on the political spectrum right now. Housing is an issue for young people.
Well, young people
older
particularly.
in these, it's got to be, and nothing in the budget, nothing very substantial on housing in the budget.
That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests. Politics UK will be here tomorrow on 12:15 on BBC Two and the iPlayer, and I'll be back on Monday. Have a great weekend.
Got a story to tell?
What I'm going to try and do is go to schools and educate a lot